My name is Emily Mello, and I'm the Associate Director of Education at the New Museum. I join you today from the unceded land of the Lenape people, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to the Lenape people and elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. On behalf of the New Museum, I am glad to welcome you to today's conversation between Adam Pendleton and Andrew Westover. This program series includes over a dozen artist conversations presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America. Programs like this are core to the New Museum's work of advancing new art and new ideas. I would particularly like to thank Education and Public Engagement staff members, Andrea Calderis and Derek Wright, as well as the entire New Museum team for their help in bringing this program together. New Museum digital initiatives are generously supported by Hermione and David B. Heller. We also thank our members and supporters like you who help make these programs possible. I will now share brief biographical notes about this program's featured artist. Adam Pendleton is a New York-based artist known for work informed by what the artist calls Black Dada, a critical articulation of blackness, abstraction, and an avant-garde sensibility. Pendleton's conceptually rigorous and formally inventive paintings, collages, videos, and installations have been the subject of solo exhibitions across the United States and abroad at institutions including Kunst-Werke Institute for Contemporary Art Berlin, the Baltimore Museum of Art, MIT's Liszt Visual Arts Center, Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and Le Consortium Dijon. His 2016 solo exhibition, Becoming Imperceptible, was organized by the Contemporary Art Center in New Orleans and traveled to the Museum of Contemporary Art Denver before closing at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland. In 2021, Pendleton will open a major solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. His Black Dada Reader, a collection of documents and essays from various sources that relate to the conceptual framework of Black Dada, was published in 2017 by Koenig Books and was subsequently named as one of the best art books of 2017 by the New York Times. Pendleton's work is held in numerous public collections, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Guggenheim Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Carnegie Museum of Art, the MCA in Chicago, the MCA in San Diego, the Dallas Museum of Art, and the Tate London, amongst others. A few notes before we begin. This program will last approximately an hour. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at any time, clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type your question. Please note that this program is being recorded, so your question will be recorded as well. If there's time, our speakers will answer questions during the Q&A at the end of the program. Finally, I encourage you to learn more about our upcoming programs at on our website, as well as digital content, newmuseum.org. Now, with further ado, I turn the conversation over to the New Museum's Keith Haring, Director of Education and Public Engagement, Andrew Westover.
Great, thank you so much, Emily, for that introduction. And thank you as well to the entire New Museum team who've helped make this happen. I'm delighted and honored to welcome artist Adam Pendleton to this conversation this evening. Adam is, of course, one of the featured artists in our current exhibition, Grief and Grievance, an exhibition that spans 37 artists' work from multiple generations. It was originally conceived by groundbreaking curator Okwui Enwezor, and then realized with the assistance of 4 curatorial advisors, Naomi Beckwith, Glenn Ligon, Mark Nash, and of course our artistic director, Massimiliano Gioni. I encourage all of you to come see the show if you haven't already. It does span the entirety of the museum, and while I'm obviously biased, I do think it's an important show to see, especially now. Adam is a New York-based artist, as Emily said, and has significant New Museum connections prior to this exhibition. His work was included in the first New Museum Triennial Younger Than Jesus in 2009. And as Emily mentioned, he's shown widely, nationally and internationally over the past 15 years. So Adam, first, welcome. We're really, really glad to have you as part of this conversation this evening.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm happy to be here.
I was thinking perhaps we could start by sharing a bit more about how you came to be connected with Okwui in the first place. The two of you have a long series of connections, and I know you were included in the Belgian pavilion when Okwui curated the Venice Biennale in 2015, but I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to how you met and your relationship.
Well, I actually did not Excuse me, I dropped something.
No worries.
I actually believe that I came to know Okwui through a book. That's really how I would describe my meeting of Okwui, was through the book, The Short Century, that was published, and I believe it was published in 2001 and related to an exhibition that was staged at MoMA PS1 in 2002. And the book itself is groundbreaking, as was the exhibition. And it basically looked at the history of, I believe it was the entire continent of Africa, through the work of many artists from 50, I believe, countries in Africa, and spanned the time frame from 1945 to 1994. And so that's a book that I have used in my own work, images and pages from that book. And they actually even appear in the installation in the new museum's lobby, which I don't know if anyone has noticed yet or not, but the ghost, the voice, the brilliance of Okwui is present. And I think it's fitting that that would be my introduction to his work, and that it would kind of, in a way, culminate with being a part of this very important exhibition, because I think in some ways they speak to each other. Because I think one of the core things that Okwui was trying to explore in The Short Century was how political strife, in this instance, a desire for decolonizing Africa, a desire for liberation, what impact did that have on culture and art, film, music, architecture? How does that kind of filter down, filter out, and influence the cultural space?
You know, that's really interesting too, in the way that your introduction would be through text. I think when many people think about your work and have seen your work, text and its relationship to meaning is so critical. And yet that friction and that frisson that you afford across your practice, I think is particularly generative. I wonder, Derek, can you go ahead and start the slides? We pulled a couple of slides up so we could take a look first at the installation that is currently in the new museum's lobby. Adam, I wonder if you could perhaps walk us through a bit at what we're seeing as we enter this space, because it really does command the space and set the stage for many of the questions considered throughout the exhibition.
Absolutely. So I believe I started working on this installation in spring 2020, just when the lockdown had started. And I had become preoccupied with this language, see the sin. And I initially thought that it would feature prominently in the installation. And it is present, but it's not the only language that is present. And so I worked on this installation for about, I would say, a year. And there was kind of one draft of it that I worked on again in the spring of 2020. And then there was another draft that I worked on after the summer of protests that took place in New York. And one of the things that really struck me about the protests that took place in New York, but of course all around the world, was how there were these visual remnants that were influencing and changing the visual space of New York. And I couldn't help but notice it. ACAB 1312. And I was particularly interested in ACAB because I had, in 2008, begun a group of paintings that I refer to as the Black Dada paintings, which are largely abstract paintings, but they incorporate letters from the phrase Black Dada, which of course include the letters A, C, A, and B. And so I'm always struck about how language is linguistic, yes, but it's also symbolic, and its meaning, its weight, its materiality can shift, and it does shift and changes over time. And so that became kind of a foundational element of the installation, but it's a rather capacious space visually, and I would argue conceptually, because the language is fragmented, and I'm really thinking of it as material. And I was also thinking about Richard Serra's early work, Verb List, where he made just a list of verbs to fold, to bend, to scratch. And again, this feeling that language can have sculptural weight, a sculptural quality. And I hope that's something that comes across in the installation.
That's really true. And I think that's something that we see across the work, both in the application on the wall, the way that you've treated the wall, the way that the wall holds the work holds the wall, and then also in the framed work above it. I wonder if you could speak perhaps specifically to what the material is that we're seeing here.
Well, it's funny because this is really a drawing. The entire installation is a kind of drawing for me. And what you're seeing are my drawings existing in different formats and at different scales and in different materials. So the glass wall of the lobby is covered in what I refer to as a wall work, which are floor to ceiling works, and as well as the main lobby wall. But on top of those walls, kind of playing with your sense of perception, are framed drawings that are on Mylar, which is a clear plastic material. And so the logic of the installation becomes a bit, I would say, spatially confusing, because what you think is one surface becomes another surface. And so there are these shifts in how you interpret and experience and encounter the work in the space.
It's really interesting the way you have been able to translate language across media. I think that pushes forward some of your earlier work too, in the sense that I think one of the things that first came to light for many was your Black Dada Reader, that incredible text that has become sort of a cornerstone for many folks in thinking about and understanding art now. And I wonder if you could speak a bit towards how that process of creating that text also continues to inflect or reflect with your current practice, because it has been a minute since that text came out, and yet it's still quite core to what you do.
Yeah, it's funny because I really work rather slowly, and I end up being preoccupied with the same images, the same words, the same language for a rather extended period of time. For example, Okwi's book is something that I still pick up, but I've been looking at it now for, I would say, well over a decade, for example. And yes, the Black Dada text was written in 2008, but I was looking at it earlier today, and it's still something that I'm trying to make sense of. And I think what allows it to continue to be a rich space, a space that continues to give me materials to work with, is that it moves in many directions at once, and it speaks to a tension between representation and abstraction and representation. And so these images are from the spiral bound Black Dada Reader, which I assembled in 2011. So that was 3 years after I wrote the text. So you kind of can see how I move slowly every 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, I do something else. And then, so this was kind of a book for myself, but it was also, again, a kind of a drawing, I would say, a drawing in book form. And I think this space actually was when I really started to grapple with not only what Black Dada is, what does Black Dada do, but what does Black Dada look like? Which is a way of saying, what does my work look like? So I was using the book as a space, as a form to kind of address these questions head on. And later, this book was translated yet again into a hardcover form and included essays from a range of curators like Adrian Edwards and Jenny Schlinska and Laura Hoffman, and as well as my original Black Dada text. And I also wrote an afterwards, so to speak, in the book as well. So again, another kind of process of translation about how information is framed, how images are framed, how things move across time as well.
You know, that sort of relationship between how something presents and what something is, I think, is particularly interesting in both how you speak about your work and how it shows up. I'm wondering if you could dive into that perhaps a bit more, specifically with regard to the reader, because it has shown up in these different ways. And we've talked a bit about like the formal capacity of that, but has that meant anything for the content of it?
I think so. I think it's a curious experience, Andrew, to, these texts are in other books, right? And so you could read the text like the Hugo Ball Dada Manifesto or The Pitfalls of Liberalism by Stokely Carmichael, or Black Dada Nihilismus by Mary Baraka or Leroy Jones, or Gertrude Stein's textual portraits. So, they're obviously, I'm pulling them from one book to create another book. But I do think when you pick up the reader, the way in which you kind of relate to the material completely shifts. And that is because of a kind of material reality that the reader does not feel simply like a book. It feels also like a work of art. So I think it changes what your expectations are, which I think is interesting, because I think in a book, or holding a book that is, just simply text on a page, you expect one thing. But I think when there are these kind of stutters, when you're kind of exhausting in one sense what a book can do, what a book can be, I think that's a very different kind of dynamic, a very different kind of feeling.
One of actually, this popped up just a second ago in the question. Someone was asking about your founding of the Dada Artists Book Press, right. Especially your choice to start off by republishing Norman Pritchard's Echoes, which I can never say correctly because of all the
right.
letters that are incorporated.
Which is great, right? Words you can't say.
Yeah.
Right.
It's
Words
rare
you can't
in some
say,
ways.
Text you can't read. So all of these problems that shape our experience and how we make sense of ourselves in and through language.
As I go across your large body of work and think about how you engage with language and abstraction, I think I've questioned several times how you've chosen to do that across different media as well. We've talked so far about drawing in different formats, it being in the text itself with the Black Dada reader, but then also some of your earlier, more time-based work, the performance from Performa that is so often cited, or your video work too, that there's still this relationship with abstraction that I'm interested to hear how you find working through it across different media may impact the various possibilities it affords.
I get that question in different forms often. And for me, I begin with a kind of idea, but I would also say that I'm really a painter who's preoccupied with how ideas exist in space. And so these different mediums, these different modes, these different mechanisms allow me to activate ideas within different spaces, or to create space. So I think that's one of the main things that I hope my paintings do, for example, is create space. I think that's one of the things, like the wall work that we're looking at right now does. It creates space. And so here is an interesting example of me taking the spreads from the reader and creating a wall work. So you're kind of end up now walking, in this instance, literally kind of walking into the space of the reader. So again, that process of translation. So it's a kind of refusal to exist as any one thing. And I would refer to that as the kind of refusal work, the refusal to exist in any other way other than through the frame of abstraction. There's actually this, and I think it's worth reading, and I just came across it today, this Adrian Piper quote that is included in the Black Dada Reader, that I think is worth reading, if I can quickly find it, Andrew.
Please.
Where she says, abstraction is also flight. It is freedom from the immediate spatio-temporal constraints of the moment, freedom to plan the future, recall the past, comprehend the present from a reflective perspective that incorporates all three. Freedom from the immediate boundaries of concrete subjectivity, freedom to imagine the possible and transport oneself into it, freedom to survey the real as a resource for embodying the possible. And that's from Flying, which she wrote in 1987. And so I would also say that these different mediums allow for a different kind of freedom. Working on a video, for example, a video portrait is very different than working on a painting, but they also, all of these modes have their constraints. So I'm at least always trying to free myself of the constraints of any given medium.
It's fascinating to think of abstraction in relation to freedom, because I think for some folks, they would take an almost absolutely opposite take to say that abstraction in some ways provides limits or bounds.
Why would you say that? Why do you say that?
So I think the way I'm coming at that too is also coming from the quote that you just shared, in that when she's speaking of freedom, there's that bit about it becoming in some ways atemporal or transtemporal, that it affords something that wouldn't otherwise be possible by also denying the strictures of time. And I think what's interesting with abstraction is when it's been presented visually, sometimes it's been said that what it does is means it's presented as you cannot then be figurative, right? Abstraction as the antithesis of figuration. But what I find really generative in how you're presenting it is instead that it's an opportunity to open beyond, rather than a limitation prescribing one cannot do X, Y, Z.
Yes, that is what I'm saying. Yes.
Sorry, didn't mean to start with a negative to assume an argument.
No, but it's true. I think it's this desire to be perpetually becoming, to not, basically, honestly, to not be marked or identified by the limits of the body, or how my body might be perceived, or how my body might exist or function in the world at any given moment. And I think that is one of the interests that I have in the video portraits, is how do we describe the self? How is the self recalled or realized at any given moment?
I find that really profound, frankly. I think there is such slipperiness right now in trying to understand one's body in relation to oneself and others that many are trying to articulate in a very grounded and importantly transparent way, but one that often can become slippery in ways that people don't necessarily intend. And I think that your acknowledgement of that is part of what I find so compelling across your body of work. I think in some ways that brings me to a question I'd wanted to ask about your writing this past summer that was shared quite broadly, both I believe it was Art News and then the New York Times, specifically thinking about what was happening last summer, but doing that in a much more structural and perhaps arguably abstract way in the sense of how the language was conveyed. But I found it to be both clear when it really needed to be, and also prescient towards some of the claims that were later made elsewhere. I would love to hear your thoughts about those types, how they came to be, how you decided upon them, and what you think of them now.
I think when I wrote those texts that was a very unusual thing. Both of those texts were unusual things for me to do. They were unusual texts, unusual contributions for me to make. And the sense that I'm usually not editorializing or, contributing what one could understand as a kind of editorial text. As we've been talking about, most of the language that I'm using is sort of veering towards abstraction. And I had the impulse, I had the desire to say certain things. And I also was thinking about this tension between being an artist and being a citizen and how they relate or don't relate to each other, which is to say, to think of myself as a political being and then as an artistic being, and how these things really kind of infect each other, at least they do for me. And how the voice of an artist is often missing from these socio-political, socio-cultural dynamics. We hear from our politicians, we even hear from, museum boards and corporations, but where are the voices of artists, and how can the voice of an artist be mobilized effectively into public discourse? So again, in a strange way, but in a similar way, thinking about the weight of language, the potential of language, but here I think in very different kinds of spaces in the New York Times, for example. And so when the New York Times originally approached me, they wanted me to do an art op-ed, which I think was essentially sort of like, oh, there's a piece of your art and that's it. And I basically retorted that, look, I'll do an art op-ed, but you have to publish my writing. And I sent this, I think for them, a very kind of unusual text. And they ended up publishing it. And that text was actually also in some way related to the way in which I'm using language in the installation in the new museum. In the new museum installation as well. Again, thinking of it as sculpture, as a material weight, as a material reality. But if we think about this title as heavy as sculpture, what am I saying is as heavy as sculpture? And I think there are different ways to read that. And I'm also saying, and I'm kind of responding to the premise of the exhibition in the installation as well, grief me not. So we have this kind of notion of grief and grievance. Grief, and I think it was implied that it was speaking to sort of the experience of Black people in America, and grievance was kind of the experience of white people in America. And I was kind of retorting, grief me not. And so, but then still, what is as heavy as sculpture? And I think that was a part of that for me, was speaking to the way I am presumed to exist in the world, the weight that my body, my presence might have in the world. And in a way, you can see actually in the bottom left corner of the image, there's a text fragment that says, "Burn it down." And so there's also this kind of violence, there's also this kind of opportunity, there's also kind of this poetics to how I might want to be legible or illegible within the space of my work, which is, of course, again, a statement about abstraction.
That one phrase that you mentioned earlier, "see the sin," I'm particularly interested in that because I think sin is a word that has such particular connotations and ideas that circulate with it, often religiously inflected, but also one that's rarely used in the public sphere.
Mm-hmm.
And I was interested to hear why sin?
I think, I think on the one hand, there might seem to be a kind of religious overtone, sin, as the sinner, they sin, the original sin. And I think I'm playing with all of those things, but I think the words before sin are just as important, so you could really be pointing towards anything. And sin can, at least in the way I'm using it here, be rather both explicit or implicit at the same time. But I think it's there are all of these directions in this installation, and as in the piece, as heavy as sculpture: kill, burn it down, grief me not, see the sin, burn. So, for the people. So there are all of these kind of, and I think it's a curious thing. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? Kill, burn, these kind of, this language that suggests a kind of violence, but I would also say somehow relates to a kind of hopelessness, but also a kind of hope. What comes after after we have a kind of clarity about where we are or where we might be going.
Where we might be going, I think, is a good way to move to the next bit, which was to ask a little bit about where your personal work, where your practice is going in the near future. I know you have several major exhibitions coming up, and it would be great to hear perhaps a bit from you about where you're thinking forward.
Well, I've been recently, well, not recently. Well, I guess for me, in the way time works for me, it's all very recent. But for the past several years, I've been working on a body of paintings, the untitled "We Are Not," and this one has just come up in the slideshow, and I continue to work on that body of work, and that the language in these paintings, it was occasioned by a series of statements that I made in the Black Dada text, where it kind of toggles between we are statements and we are not statements. And one of the things that happens in the space of these paintings is the language becomes confused and conflictual and dense and layered, and again legible and illegible at the same time. So it at one moment reads, we are not, but then we not, we are not, we are not nots. And, you know, this kind of, again, this kind of exhaustion.
It's as you're speaking those words, in some ways, pardon the associative train, it reminds me of the ritual uses of language, how in spaces where they're sort of incanted, they can become mixed, and as they are mixed, the meaning can expand and contract, not necessarily in direct lines. And I think that's something that in this work we see really, really profoundly, really directly. And it's also interesting here to see just the degree of layering that's actually accomplished within the work itself. How many layers seems impossible to ask, but to what degree are we seeing multiple layers? Can you talk about the process of these?
Sure. You're probably seeing, I would say, I mean, these surfaces are rather worked, but again, it's like this process of translation, because one thing is photographed and then layered into another part of the painting process, and this process kind of continues until it's exhausted, or until I'm satisfied, or till I think it's visually satisfying or coherent, although coherent is, I think, maybe not the appropriate word to use. But there's also a change in scale, because actually what I'm working on is you know, maybe yay big sometimes much larger, but then it ends up being, for example, this painting is nearly 20 feet wide. And so again, that's the kind of confusion that I'm interested in, and asking the viewer to ask themselves, what am I looking at? And that's also one of the, I think, the productive work that language does, is it presents itself as something that should be understood, that could be and should be read, but you often misrecognize it, you misread it, you kind of aren't able to fully understand its capability, its realm of possibility, the realm of possibilities that it presents or affords. So they're layered in the physical sense and the conceptual sense in terms of process, but they're also, of course, hopefully layered in the ways in which they can be read and understood. Even though I would hope in a way they refuse to be understood.
That refusal, I'm really interested in that. You've mentioned that a couple of times through, and we see that specifically in this work, that it's what we are is not, just to read straight across. Negation in your work and its relation to abstraction. Do you see negation as a core component of it, or is that simply something in this series?
That, I think that's, I would say that's an aspect of it, but there's also something to negate, I would argue, is also to affirm. So it's the way in which absence can function as presence, and vice versa.
It sounds like the way that I've heard you describe Black Dada as a way to think about past and future in concurrent ways.
At the same time.
There's a lot of value in each of these, I think. Thank you for walking us through these. I think now we'll turn over just for a moment to see questions that may have arisen from the audience. One thing that, let's see, I'll take a quick look through here. And again, I'll encourage folks, if you'd like to go ahead and drop a question in the Q&A box down there at the bottom. We will probably not get to every question, but we will review what we can and come around to them. I think there's a couple here right now that are thinking about, well, here's one about catharsis, which I think is interesting in your work, because from what I've heard you say so far, in fact, that's not necessarily the direct approach, that this idea of no sign of catharsis at the core, and that's what's referenced here, and that there might in fact be in this negation a sense of cancellation. Do you have any thoughts in that direction?
I have difficulty with the concept of a catharsis or of a cathartic moment, and you know, I think I'm more interested in the complex real and sort of troubling the real, and the moments of recognition that are direct. But that is not to say direct and specific, but it is to say direct to, again, create a kind of site, a moment of engagement, of a direct engagement.
Here's a question that I think is quite direct, asking about the surface of the work. I think it's particularly in the lobby, if someone comes in, it's a little tricky in these digital images to have a sense of what the surfaces themselves actually, what their tactile quality may be. Could you speak a bit also maybe perhaps to, you spoke about how some of it is digitally rendered and then there's the repetition. What would it feel or appear to be for someone who's actually in the space?
You know, it's funny because I think a lot of people think that the wall works are painted directly on the wall. And I think, and then a lot of people think that the Mylar works are actually on paper. And I like these moments of confusion where you can't really discern the material realities of the work. I think that's the same thing when you look at the We Are Not paintings, for example. I think perhaps you might think, oh, this is spray paint, or, you know, so I want people to kind of have trouble or have to break down how something was made. I think that's an important component of the work. In a way, it's my palette that are these different material realities and how they influence and affect your perception of the work.
Yeah. In some of the later work, where it's increasing in size, there's a question here about how you consider size and scope of your work and the relation perhaps to the viewer, if that's a component part of your consideration.
Yes, it is a very important part. And I think that's notable, again, in the installation that's currently on view at the museum, is that it embodies you. And that was something I was actually very concerned about when I was working on this piece, because the lobby actually doesn't allow that. It's both there and not there, strangely enough. There are these very large walls. There's the wall directly behind the reception desk, and then there's also this glass wall, and then you have the gift shop. But so it's kind of diffused, and I really wanted to kind of create some sort of pressure, visual pressure, where you would really kind of feel the visual weight of the work when you entered. And I originally wasn't quite sure how that could be achieved in a space that kind of felt like it. I think that's kind of the opposite of what a lobby is supposed to do. I don't think it is supposed to necessarily feel as though it's creating a kind of pressure on the person who's coming into the space. I think it's supposed to feel like it's opening up and, you know, kind of allowing you to start to imagine where you might go, particularly in a museum. Where do I need to go? Where do I want to go? Where might I go? But I wanted people to kind of stop, to almost get stuck in the lobby. And I think by creating a wall at the back of the space, which was typically transparent, the glass wall, by making it opaque, it kind of focuses and forces your attention to stop. when you initially enter the space.
And in that, your work, obviously, one thing we hadn't noted yet was your use of color, that yes, it's black and white, which I think is quickly visible, and it's also shades between and different blacks, and there's a lot of variety within what may at first appear to be a simple duality, which I think equally applies to much of your language. Could you speak about how you think about color?
I think one of the, I was speaking to what I would call my palette, and I think, I use what is necessary. And so, for example, in the video portraits, I'm often using a combination of black and white and color. And so again, whatever is necessary, but I think in a lot of the paintings and in the installations, what is necessary are these material realities and how we perceive them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's ongoing questions that relate to what other influences may you be drawing upon? Which I think you've spoken a lot about what went into the Dada reader, which I think is, a vast swath of human knowledge production. But are there other things that may influence how you think about your work or consider it beyond perhaps what's represented in the reader?
I think one of the things that I'm been thinking about a lot are sort of contrapuntal realities. So where many things are layered on top of each other. So it's not a kind of one thing at a time, but it's two things at a time, three things at a time, four things at a time, but not just the confusion or the chaos of many things existing in relationship to each other at once, but how things can still remain distinct in that kind of situation, in that kind of dynamic. So you might hear one song and then another song is layered on top of that. But I'm kind of interested in creating a space where you perceive the layering, where nothing is overwhelmed by something else, which is a kind of a tricky thing, but I think it's actually how we experience the world, how we move through the world. There are always many things happening at once.
That's interesting too, because I think in some ways it reflects how I've read some of your texts, in that you are indicating not only that there are clear narratives, but also that these narratives are distinct and concurrent, and that in the installation too, in the lobby, you're able to pull from so many vastly disparate places, and yet create something that still feels unified and whole, in the sense that it does encapsulate you when you walk into that space. That sort of immersion, is that, to what degree is that important to realizing the work? Is that envelopment in the world that you're creating?
I think the world that I am creating. So I would push back that it's not so much that I'm creating a world, because there's something for me that relates in that way to fiction, actually, sort of creating a world, or the he's creating a world, I'm I'm in the world, I'm sort of I'm doing the work in the world, in the real, in a sense of the real. But what I think I am trying to do is provide the opportunity to reinterpret, reread the world. But it's not that I'm essentially trying to create a world. I'm not really into this any sort of fictitious or fictional or a kind of suspended space or reality.
That entirely makes sense and is my misspeak. In some ways, when I personally think of your work, I see it as creating an insight into the world we have that becomes a different world than the one that we currently inhabit. Um, a couple questions here are asking about other artists who may be influence or interlocutors for you. A couple of names that I'll just toss out that are coming up here. Feel free to yay or nay or skip entirely. Sometimes this can be a terrible game and you're welcome to shut it down immediately. But of the ones that have popped up so far, I see Christopher Wool, I see Picasso, I see someone mentioning Sanskrit art. And then also, interesting one that's speaking about monumentality in the US, think about Confederate monuments. So that would love to hear more about other visual reference or references or even interlocutors of any stripe.
Well, I think the 37 artists that are in Grief and Grievance are all artists who I think are I'll just say it. I think are real giants who are contributing such significant work to contemporary culture. And they're all people that I want to be in dialogue with, hope I am in conversation with, even if we're not picking up the phone and talking to each other every day. I think ideas translate, are shared in so many kinds of ways. And I think that's one of the most powerful things about an exhibition, is it's space for the exchange of ideas where, again, these kind of radical juxtapositions can occur. Let's say nearly all of the 37 artists and Grief and Grievance. That's such a safe answer, isn't it, Andrew?
But it is a very safe answer.
But there's a lot of truth to it, and I think that's really one of the striking things about the show, and also Okwi's vision, and the vision that I think a lot of other curators share, that I think Okwui was in conversation with, and again, maybe not picking up the phone, but there's a kind of a dialogue occurring. And I think for example, Adrian Edwards' show, Blackness and Abstraction, and how a lot of the artists who were in that exhibition are in Grief and Grievance, and how these things kind of influence and speak to each other and change our perceptions of things.
In some ways, I think by virtue of where your work is placed in the exhibition, it's able to physically do that, which is a wonderful bit of connective tissue and truth that's afforded, that your work is one that's quite literally walked through in order to see the full thing at multiple times, which I think is a gift. Perhaps one towards the end question, because I know we're approaching time here. Looking across that installation, one of the things that I find particularly compelling is the way that you're able to layer in texts across time. You've spoken about how your work speaks to a non-chronological sense of time. And many of them come, I assume, from your work with archives and or your personal collections. Are there any things that might not be readily apparent to someone who's coming in, taking a quick look and moving forward to see the rest of the exhibition, that you'd like to particularly call attention to?
Well, I think I said it earlier, and I'll say it again, and that Okwui is there. he's in the space of the work.
I think that's a beautiful way to hold it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Andrew.
you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course. I do want to encourage everyone who is watching. Again, the show is up for another couple of months in New York. We would love to welcome you back. This work gets at the heart of many of the questions that are central to the exhibition. Thank you all for spending time with us today. And I look forward to seeing your work as it continues forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.